Here now to act as your host and guide through a program of remembrances, evocations, film, pictures, music, and friends and family. Here is a fine writer, the author of the wonderful book, Banished Children of Eve, and a good friend of Frank McCourt's. Please welcome your host, Peter Quinn.
I am not the chancellor of the city schools, but I do have the same hairline as the chancellor of the city. And I think I speak for all New Yorkers when I say how wonderful it is that at last there's a school named for a great teacher instead of a dead general or a half-forgotten politician. I know I speak for Frank's old friends when I point out that a few decades ago, if anyone was taking odds on the city institution most likely to bear the McCourt name, the smart money would have been on the Brooklyn House of Detention. Now, for my part, the thought of participating in this tribute to my friend Frank McCourt leaves me, and Isaiah was quoting Irish, so let me use the Irish word for verklempt. I'm also a little disappointed. For years, I've looked forward to Frank speaking at my memorial service. I even had the remarks written that he was going to give. What a great job Frank would have done in embellishing and elevating the paltry achievements of the deceased. Frank's life, on the other hand, requires no gilding. The plain truth will do. On a personal level, I couldn't stand here today without acknowledging my deep indebtedness to him. Frank was among the most generous writers who ever lived. And let's tell the truth. Generosity isn't a quality for which writers, especially famous writers, and most especially famous Irish writers, are universally known. As far as I can tell, Frank never turned down a request for a blurb. Looking out at this audience, while I was looking before the lights went on, I could see at least 347 writers who had their books blurbed by Frank. 348 if I count myself. At times, I was ashamed to ask Frank for another blurb, but never ashamed enough to stop asking. Unfortunately, even Frank's well-honed skills in the art of blurbology couldn't rescue my books from obscurity. Nonetheless, Frank assisted me in other ways. Early on, I learned a trick that I'll share with fellow writers or would-be writers in this room, sure that it will never leave this hall. Whenever you go into a bookstore, remove the covers from Frank's books and put them on yours. You're laughing. The results were immediate and measurable. Over the years, I've sold thousands of my books with Frank's covers on them. I knew Frank for over 30 years. If there's one thing I learned about him in all that time, it was his love of provoking and being provoked. In that spirit, let me begin with something I know would provoke him, a quote from Scripture. Not only Scripture, but from the Catholic Scripture and not the King James Version, from the Gospel of Matthew about another great teacher. Quote, "And large crowds gathered wherever he went, and he taught them." Tonight is a reminder that even in death, the crowds gather for Frank, who continues to outdraw almost any other living writer, and the dead ones, too, for that matter. And through his books and the lives of all those he touched in the classroom, Frank continues to teach us. Here to pay tribute to Frank McCourt, teacher man, are Susan Jane Gilman, former student of his and now a best-selling author in her own right, and Tom Allen, publisher and former teaching colleague. Now, one caveat. As Ted Smith recently reminded me, Frank had no use for New Age notions of death as only a stage in our spiritual growth. "I want mourning and weeping," Frank said. "I want wailing and keening and hair pulled out, garments rent, the gnashing of teeth, with teeth provided to those who don't have any." Isaiah, do you have a supply of teeth back there? I'm not sure. So please, as well as sticking to the schedule, I ask all the speakers here tonight to be as morose and maudlin and mournful as possible. And one final thing. You'll see various sayings flashing on the screen as the evening proceeds. These were some of Frank's favorites, and I don't think I'm letting the cat out of the bag when I tell you none are from the collected works of George Bush or Dick Cheney. Susan Jane Gilman, please welcome her.